Toyota Corolla. KRS 178, if you could please move your car. And, no, sorry, it was a Kia HAN 199. If you could move your car, they can't park there. Underneath the building, there's plenty of parks down there. Thank you. Arnold, it's a privilege for us to welcome you here in New Zealand and in Auckland. Looking forward what you have to share. So would you please come up and give Arnold a big hand of welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, anybody, are we on? Okay. Anybody not get the copy of the outline? Raise your hand, we'll get them out to you real quick. Anyone not get one? Looks like we did well. And also, you want to turn to page 7. This is going to be starting. Now, every summer, in our summer, in the other side of the world, we run a Messianic special school, and we have our courses divided. We begin with a 2-week curriculum, then a 3-week, then a 1-week, then a 2-week, and then we conclude in Labor Day weekend. So we begin the first Saturday in July and end after the Labor Day weekend in September. And all the other courses are on a 5-year cycle, so you have to come for 5 summers to get everything we offer. But the one course we teach every year is the course on the life of the Messiah from a Messianic Jewish perspective, and because of its importance, it's a 25-hour course that we cover in 1 week, 3 hours in the morning and 2 hours in the evening. And you're more than welcome to attend. Before COVID hit us, we have people coming from the North Island, the South Island, the West Island, and so on. The West Island is also called Australia. Egypt. Now, but I will say more about the nature of the ministry and so on, probably more likely tomorrow, or we'll see, and then Johan will, on the last day, say more about the local work here in New Zealand. And one of the courses we teach is the one that was chosen for this area, and that is Israel Past, Present, and Future. And it's really a 15-hour course. And we had 15 hours to do it down in Christchurch and then in Wellington. But here we're just giving basically about 45-hour minutes. So I'm not going to be able to cover everything we normally cover. We'll do a highlights version, so we'll pick certain key elements from Israel Past, and then later on Israel Present, and finally on Israel Future. We're not going to be able to cover everything that we try to have. But when I did my doctoral work at New York University, out of my dissertation came out this book, Israelology, The Missing Link in Systematic Theology, and this is the complete system. However, most people don't read big books anymore. So here we have, this is an abridged version of this one. It just summarizes the chapters where we deal with different schools of replacement theology. But what we have primarily here is chapter 10 of this book, and then we also have some of the appendices. So if you have this book and you look through this book, everything I say will be in this book, but there's a lot more in the book than I'll have time to speak with here. So just keep those things in mind. So we're going to go ahead and begin with Israel Past. And turn your Bibles to the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 4. Deuteronomy chapter 4. The Bible talks about two different types of elections. There's the individual election, which leads to individual salvation. That would not be our theme for this week, these few days, because we'll be dealing not with an individual election, but with national election where God chose one nation. Because there's a great conflict between Calvinism and Arminianism about the individual election. Both theologies do believe in election, but they can have a different view in the source of election. Again, this goes beyond our theme for this particular conference. But I'll give you an example of the difference between Calvinist election and Arminian election. If an Arminian falls down the stairs, he'll pick himself up, brush himself off, and he'll say, I'll have to be more careful next time. If a Calvinist falls down the steps, he also picks himself up and he brushes them off, and he will say, well, I'm glad that's over with. That's the only major key difference. So national election is that Israel is the elect nation. So what does that mean? Two things it is not. It does not guarantee the spiritual salvation of every individual of that nation. And secondly, it does not guarantee the physical salvation of every individual of that nation. What it does mean is two things. It guarantees that God's purposes for choosing that nation will be fulfilled in the course of time. And secondly, guarantees a future time when the whole nation will come to faith, a spiritual nation that will be fulfilled. That's not true of all Jews of all time, only of all Jews of a certain point of time. When we get to Israel's future, we'll see what that certain time is. Now, following your outline, point 1, the election of Israel, small a, the fact of Israel's election. And look at chapter 4 and verse 37. Chapter 4, verse 37. And because he loved your fathers, therefore he chose their seed after them, and brought you out with his presence and with his great power out of the land of Egypt. Now what we learn is that the basis of Israel's election had to do with God's love, in particular with the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. There's a common misconception that the Jews were already there as a people, and then God chose them. Actually, he chose one man. So as you read through Genesis chapter 10, you read of the 70 Gentile nations arising from the 3 sons of Noah. When you get to chapter 12, God now calls upon Abram, and he says, I will make a new nation of you. So the actual basis for God's love for Israel is based upon the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And on that basis, God chose Israel to be his elect nation. And on that basis, he rescued Israel out of Egypt. But the choice for Israel was already made when there was only one man, and that man is Abram, that became Abraham. Now skip over to chapter 7 and look at verse 6. Chapter 7 and verse 6. For you are a holy people unto Jehovah your God. Jehovah your God had chosen you to be a people for his own possession, above all peoples that are upon the face of the earth. Jehovah did not set his love upon you, nor choose you because you were more in number than any people, for you were the fewest of all peoples. But because Jehovah loved you, and because he would keep the oath which he swore unto your fathers, had Jehovah brought you with a mighty hand, and redeemed you out of the house of bondage from the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. So in these verses, notice in verse 6, he declares Israel to be a holy people. Not because they had some natural innate righteousness. In fact, later in chapter 9, verses 4 through 6, chapter 9, verses 4 through 6, he points out that They were not particularly holy as a people. But because God had chosen Israel, and because of that choice, they are holy in the sense they are set apart from all other nations. So as a result of being chosen by God, Israel was set apart from the other 70 nations listed in Genesis chapter 10. And Israel was chosen to be a special possession above all other nations. So in this book, in chapter 14, verse 2, Deuteronomy 14:2, Israel is the chosen people of God. In Deuteronomy chapter 26, verse 18, Deuteronomy 26:18, because of this special status, Israel should keep the commandments of God. And furthermore, when he brought them out of Egypt, and when they finally arrived at the foot of Mount Sinai in Exodus chapter 19, verse 6, Exodus 19, verse 6, he points out Israel should be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Now, as a nation with 12 different tribes, there was one tribe that represented them before God. That's the tribe of Levi or Levi. And so those members of the tribe of Levi who were direct descendants of Aaron would be the ones that will serve in the priesthood on behalf of Israel. And the nature of a priest is to speak on behalf of people to God. But as a nation, they should also be a kingdom of priests in the holy nation, in that they should represent the Gentile world to God. Insofar as the Canaanites, they were to be obliterated. God gave them 4 centuries to come to him. They failed to do so, so they were to be removed from the land. But insofar as other Gentile nations that Israel would come in contact with, they were to represent as a nation these people to God. Then verse 7 and 8, he emphasized the basis for Israel's election. First of all, in verse 7, negatively, not because of Israel's size, but rather in verse 8, positively, he chose Israel for 2 reasons. Number 1, God loved Israel, and the kind of love it's emphasizing with the Hebrew words is it is a covenantal love. And because of this covenantal relationship, he's got this special love for Israel. So God had a covenantal relationship with the patriarchs, and the promises he made to patriarchs must now be fulfilled in the course of the seed of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. He must keep the oath to the fathers. Secondly, for this reason, he rescued Israel out of Egypt. Now let's move on to chapter 10. As you read through the history of the wilderness wanderings and subsequent, there are periods of time when they were faithful to the Lord, but there were more periods of time where they fell into idolatry and doing seances and things of that nature. And even to our modern day, only about 30% of the Jewish population in America or Israel, I'm not sure what the percentage here would be, but only 30% follows traditional orthodoxy, and 70% does not. And my father, who was raised in a very strict Hasidic orthodoxy, ultimately, along with for the family members that survived, there were 13 Fruchtenbaum families, but 7 did not survive, 6 did. 5 moved to Israel, only 1 moved to the USA. But that was, so even to this day, the majority Jewish population is quite secular. If they do religious practices, it's only special ones and do not necessarily follow all of the traditions. So there's a story of a Jewish family that moved into a new neighborhood. The next door neighbors was a Baptist family, and they both had sons the same age. The 2 sons became friends. And one day, the Baptist son asked the Jewish son to go with him to the church, to the Sunday school class. The Jewish son asked his parents, which made the parents a bit uneasy. They were not really practicing Jewish practices. They didn't want to make it an issue, so they said, "You can go this one time, but then come back and tell us everything they taught you, just in case we need to give you a different perspective." So both sons went to the Sunday school class, and when they came back to their respective homes, the Jewish parents took the son aside and asked him, "What did they teach you in that Baptist school?" And the son says, "Oh, they taught us all about Moses." The parents were a bit surprised. "Did they really? They taught you about Moses?" The son says, "Yes, they taught us all about Moses." So the parents asked, "What did they teach you about Moses?" And the son says, "Well, what they taught us is that when Israel came under Moses to the Red Sea, and the Egyptian army began chasing them, what Moses did is build a pontoon bridge over the Red Sea. And the Jewish people ran on that pontoon bridge to the other side. And when the Egyptian army tried to pursue them, then Moses called for an airstrike that destroyed the bridge and destroyed the Egyptian army." And the parents, a bit surprised, asked him, "Is that what they really taught you in that Baptist school?" And the son says, "Well, that's not exactly the way they put it. If I told you what they really said, you'd never believe it." That captures the secular society in the Jewish world pretty well. Now here in chapter 10, verses 15 through 16, in verse 15, he focuses on the national election because God chose them for the love of the fathers, the patriarchs. The result of that love for the fathers, God chose their seed. And the seed are all the descendants of Jacob and his 12 sons that led to the 12 tribes. So they were chosen above all other peoples above the 70 nations that arose in chapter 10. But that is not necessarily relevant to individual elections. So verse 16 talks about the individual election. A national election does not guarantee the salvation of the individual. Members of the elect nation are now encouraged to circumcise their hearts. So national election has the issue of physical circumcision, but individual election is spiritual circumcision. So we come to small b, the reasons and/or purposes for Israel's election. Number one, there were to be a kingdom of priests, as we already mentioned. So Israel is to be a priestly nation to represent the Gentile nations to God. That included spelling out to them what these Gentiles would need to believe to receive eternal life. Secondly, they're to be recipients of and also be the ones to record God's revelation. These points are made in the same book in chapter 4, verses 5 to 8, chapter 4, verses 5 to 8, and chapter 6, verses 6 to 9. Chapter 6, verses 6 to 9. Also, Paul makes that point in Romans chapter 3, verses 1 and 2. Romans 3, verses 1 and 2. Down to the Jewish people were committed the oracles of God, and the oracles of God had to do with scriptures that were moved from merely verbal but to written scriptures. And therefore, it was the Jews who preserved the biblical text. If a scroll got too old to keep being used, they would have to write a new scroll and so on. And so they received divine revelation and they recorded in divine revelation, which in the course of time became the scriptures. Now the third element is to propagate the decree of one God. Let's look at the passage in Isaiah 43. Isaiah chapter 43. One common question is, what do people have to believe for salvation before the Messiah arrived? And the first messianic prophecy, I might point out, was not given to Adam, not given to Eve, but directly to Satan in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. I'll put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, you shall bruise his heel. And so now Satan knew, in the context of causing Adam and Eve to fall into sin, is that it's going to be a descendant of the woman he tempted that will be the one to come to defeat him. And so it began a long time conflict to try to avoid that. And the intermarriage that you find in Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 6, Genesis 6, 1 through 6, what you find in that passage is the correlation of marriage between fallen angels, that angels, when they appear, always appear as young men. That's true of holy angels, also fallen angels intermarrying with human women, trying to destroy the seed of the woman. When you move into the period of the covenants and so on, what does one have to believe to be saved? Looking at Isaiah chapter 43, let's begin with verse 10. Ye are Jehovah's witnesses, says Jehovah, and my servant whom I have chosen, that ye may know and believe me and understand that I am he. And before me there was no God formed, neither shall there be after me. Even I am Jehovah, and besides me there is no Savior. I have declared, and have saved, and have shown, and that there is no strange God among you. Therefore ye are my witnesses, says Jehovah, and I am God. Now what people had to believe, and what Israel had to let the Gentiles know, two basic element truths. Number one, the God of Israel is the only God. If you believe that, that rules out polytheism, it rules out idolatry, and so on. But the second thing one had to believe is that the God of Israel is the only Savior, and that rules out trusting one's own works for salvation. So these are the two basic elements, and if a Gentile believed this, he would receive his eternal life. And if he asked the question, well, how do we now live? The answer is, you live in accordance with the regulations of the Adamic and the Noahic covenants. That was the rule of life for the Gentiles. Initially also for Abraham and others, but when Moses came with his Mosaic law that God gave him. Now the issue, if a Jew receives the 2 points, he also receives eternal life. But once he asks, how do I now live? He would have to live in accordance with the laws of Moses. And that was not merely 10 commandments, it was a total of 613 commandments. And so the Gentiles had a different rule of life than Jews had a rule of life, but the faith they had to exercise was the same thing. Number one, God of Israel is the only God. Number two, he's the only Savior. But the rule of life was not the same for Jews as it was for Gentiles. Now, the fourth thing that Israel was called for to produce is to produce the Messiah. These points are going to be made in Romans chapter 9, verse 5, Romans 9:5. Hebrews chapter 2, verses 16 and 17, Hebrews 2, 16 and 17, and Hebrews 7, verses 13 and 14, chapter 7, verses 13 to 14. So as the seed concept continues, he goes from the seed of the woman to the seed of Abraham. Abraham had a total of 8 sons, and the seed would not come through only all those 8 sons, but only one son, and that is Isaac, who was the son of Sarah. Now Isaac had 2 sons, and the covenant would not be confirmed to both sons, only through one son, and that would be Jacob. And then later in Genesis chapter 49, it was confirmed to all 12 sons, and therefore they are the producers of the 12 different tribes of Israel. So looking now at the next segment, point 2, the unconditional covenants. What we mean by unconditional covenants is it is a sovereign act of God whereby God unconditionally obligates himself to bring to pass certain promises, certain blessings, certain conditions for a covenanted people. And the covenant people will be the Jewish people. And this is a unilateral covenant. It is characterized by a simple phrase, I will, which declares God determined to do exactly as he promised. I will do this, I will do that. So blessings are secured by the grace of God. Now, we call it unconditional. It does not mean there are no conditions in the covenant itself. What it means is that God's fulfillment of every promise he makes, every condition he makes, are unconditional. He will accomplish all promises that he states in the covenant. So again, the conditions in the covenant are not the basis by which the covenant will be fulfilled. God will fulfill every promise he makes, either in the short term or in the long term, but ultimately, every covenantal promise will be fulfilled. So let's list the nature of an unconditional covenant. 5 things. Number 1, these are literal covenants, and they must be interpreted literally. Secondly, they are unconditional covenants, which were not abrogated because of Israel's disobedience. Israel disobeyed frequently, but that never rendered any unconditional covenant null and void. Thirdly, these are eternal covenants and not conditioned by any elements of time. Fourthly, and these are made with one specific people, and these people is Israel. So Romans chapter 9, verse 4, Romans 9:4, he emphasizes these covenants, the unconditional ones, were made specifically with the Jewish people. In Ephesians chapter 2, verses 11 and 12, Ephesians 2, 11 and 12, these covenants belong to Israel. And the Gentiles were strangers from the covenants. It doesn't mean they were unsavable. This simply means that these covenants had both physical blessings and promises and spiritual blessings and promises. But the spiritual and physical promises were limited to Israel, and Israel alone receives the physical promises like the promise of the land, but the spiritual promises would someday go towards the Gentile believers. That promise was made with the Abrahamic covenant as early as Genesis chapter 12, verse 3. Genesis 12:3, in you shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Exactly what finally will open that door, we'll talk about a bit later. Now, here's the 5th thing we need to note. While a covenant could be signed or sealed, ratified at a specific point of time, it does not mean that every provision and or every promise goes into effect right away. Rather, as you look at these covenants, 3 things happen. Number 1, certain promises are repeated and go immediately into effect. The very same day that Abraham was told to be circumcised, on that day he was circumcised. And the same day that was promised that Isaac would be born, the covenant son be born within next year he was born. So some provisions go into effect right away. Secondly, some go into effect in the near future. And the near future could be 25 years. By the time he was actually promised a covenant son until Isaac was born, he had to wait 25 years for that promise to be fulfilled. Also, they had to wait 4 centuries before the conquest of the land would begin to be fulfilled. So some promises went into effect only in the near future. But then you have some promises that have not been fulfilled to this day, and they go into effect only in the distant prophetic future, such as being able to settle in all of the promised land. And never in biblical history or even in modern history of Israel have they possessed all of the promised land. And they will never possess all of the promised land until they become a believing people. So again, some provisions go into effect right away, some in the near future, some in the distant future. When we're dealing with small a, the Abrahamic covenant, there are specific scriptures, Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, Genesis 12, verses 1 through 3, and when he arrives at the land, another promise in verse 7. Do you have the promise of Genesis chapter 13, verses 14 through 17? Chapter 13, verses 14 through 17. In both segments of chapter 12, the land was only promised to Abram's descendants, but not to Abram personally. We get to this third passage. The promise is to you and to your seed, I will give all these lands. To you and to your seed. So Abraham is told to take a physical journey, walk the length of the land, walk the breadth of the land, because one day he'll receive it. He never received it during his lifetime, but he'll receive it in the Messianic kingdom. A fourth passage is Genesis chapter 15, verses 1 through 21. Chapter 15, verses 1 through 21. That's the occasion when the covenant was officially sealed, and the way it was sealed rendered it unconditional. There were different kinds of covenants in those days. There is the hand covenant. There's also the salt covenant. There's also other types. But the most solemn type of covenant was a blood covenant. And when two people chose to make an agreement and list all of the conditions they agreed to, then there would be one or more animals killed by the shedding of blood. The animals would be cut in half, lined up in rows, and then both parties that were making the covenant were to enter through that covenant. And once they passed through the covenant together, it would render the covenant conditional. And what that meant is, it was saying, may my blood be shed if I don't keep my part of the covenant, and if one failed to give it, he would be executed, and that frees the other party, so on. So you notice in this chapter, he does it pretty much as God commanded, take several animals, cut them in half, and so on, but then he put Abram into a deep sleep. And it was also a deep sleep, as it was also a conscious sleep, because he could see what was happening. And it will not be both God and Abram to walk between the pieces. But God appears in the form of the Shekinah, the Shekinah glory, and he, as a smoking furnace and a flax and so on, God alone walked between the pieces of the animal in a very visible way. And that rendered the covenant unconditional. And so no matter how often Abram fails, and by the way, he fails the very next chapter, chapter 16, it will not render the Abrahamic covenant null and void. With that Shekinah glory, appearance, it was unconditional. Now the fifth passage is Genesis chapter 17, verses 1 through 21, which provides the token of the covenant. Not every covenant had a token, some did. The Noahic covenant had a token, which was the rainbow, and the Abrahamic covenant was going to be circumcision. So it's in chapter 17, he tells Abram and all the other male members of his household are to be circumcised. And from then on, as soon as a Jewish child is born, you wait until the 8th day, and the 8th day will be a circumcision. The last passage is Genesis chapter 22, where he repeats some of the previous promises, and that's the last actual relationship where he spells out the Abrahamic covenant with Abram. However, there'll be other people involved very shortly. Now, God and Abram stood as the representative head of the Jewish nation. Altogether, by the way, there are 15 specific provisions. I'm not going to list them all. They'll be in the textbook if you'd like to get a hold of it. But what happens is that 3 of these 14 provisions are the ones repeated most frequently. Number 1, of Abram, he'll make an individual nation. Secondly, to this nation, he promises a land. And thirdly, to this nation, he'll bless them that bless him. He'll curse those that curse him. But then also, in you shall all the families of earth be blessed. So that of the list of 14 provisions, later on there's a 15th provision, those 3 elements were the most dominant. Now God, like I said, Abram had a total of 8 sons. God did not choose to confirm the covenant through all his 8 sons, only through one son. So if you look at Genesis chapter 26, Genesis chapter 26, a chapter devoted to Isaac, in verses 2 through 5 and verse 24. Verses 2 through 5 and verse 24, he re-emphasizes those 3 major points. But now, the covenant is going to be sustained only through one of Abram's sons, that is Isaac. Therefore, Isaac will continue the seed, and Isaac is going to be the one to receive the blessings and so on. And once again, God is going to make of Isaac a new nation, along with being descendant from Abram. Now, if you go to chapter 28, Isaac had 2 sons, but these were not just sons, they were twin sons. And God did not choose to sustain the covenant through both sons, only one, and that would be Jacob in chapter 28, verses 13 through 15. Chapter 28, verses 13 through 15. And the 3 major promises he repeats here in verses 13 through 15. And Jacob fathered 12 sons. In Genesis chapter 49, the covenant is sustained through all 12 sons, and that is why we have 12 tribes of Israel. Let's move on to the next page and talk about the continuity of the covenant. Parenthetical 5. Number 1 is the basis for the exodus out of Egypt and the giving of the land. There are a number of passages. I'll just give you 1 or 2. The rest you'll see on the screen or in the textbook. Exodus chapter 2, verses 23 to 25, chapter 2, 23 to 25, and chapter 6, verses 2 through 8. Exodus chapter 2, verses 6 to 8. Now, in the Exodus passage, he points out that the Exodus was on the basis of the Abrahamic covenant. He already promised such a deliverance in that Abrahamic covenant. As a result of that statement, as you move to chapter 4, verses 24 through 26, chapter 4, verses 24 through 26, that's why Moses almost lost his life. Moses fled from Egypt when he was 40 years old. He fled to the Midianites, and he married a Midianite woman. And the Midianites were not the group practicing circumcision, but the Midianites did not do so. So when the firstborn son of Moses, and that was the mother, was born, he did follow the Torah, followed the law he was given, which is to have that son circumcised on the 8th day. But the mother didn't like what she saw, and she's very negative towards it. So when the second son was born, because of what she felt, he refrained from circumcising the second son, which put him in disobedience to the Abrahamic covenant. So in chapter 2, God is going to rescue Israel from Egypt on the basis of the Abrahamic covenant. Now in chapter 4, how could he use someone who is being disobedient to the same covenant? And God inflicted him with some kind of malady. We don't know what kind it was. He was too weak to do the circumcision himself. And so his Midianite wife went to save her husband's life, goes ahead, and she circumcises the second son, but she didn't like what she saw. Didn't like what she had to do. So he kept calling Moses, "You are a bloody bridegroom. You are a bloody bridegroom." She was half Midianite and half British. It's also the basis for Jewish survival in Exodus chapter 32, verses 11 through 14, in 2 Kings 13, verses 22 to 23. Getting back to Zipporah, the wife of Moses, because of her attitude, he sent her back to live with her father. So she missed all of the supernatural things that were done through Moses in the land of Egypt. Only when Moses got to Mount Sinai did the father of the wife bring Moses' wife back to him with the two sons. So she missed a lot of what God was doing. It's also the basis for the messianic redemption. In Luke chapter 1, verses 54 through 73, Luke 1, 54 through 73. It's also the basis of the future resurrection. Matthew 22, verses 23 through 33. As he said in Matthew 22, 23 to 33, that in the kingdom, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob will be resurrected. They'll be living in the promised land, and people will come to visit them from the four corners of the earth. Acts 2, verses 26 to 6, verses 6 to 8. Acts 26, verses 6 to 8. There too is the basis for the resurrection from the dead. It's also the basis for the assurance of salvation in Hebrews 6, verses 13 to 20. Hebrews 6, 13 to 20. It's the basis for Israel's final restoration, something we'll see with the land covenant, in Leviticus chapter 26, verses 40 to 42. And in Galatians 3, verses 15 through 18, he draws a contrast between the Abrahamic covenant and the Mosaic covenant. The Abrahamic covenant is unconditional and always an ongoing covenant. It is eternal. But the Mosaic covenant was temporary. And we'll see why when we go to the conditional covenant in the next hour. And again, the token of this covenant would be circumcision on the 8th day of birth, and that was a sign of one's Jewish identity. And the penalty for failure to circumcise the son on the 8th day would be execution, as in Exodus 4, verses 24 through 26. All right, it's right time for your first break, so take the break and start again at 8 with the land covenant.
Could everybody just make their way back in? We're about to start and welcome Arnold back up. So if everybody can just take their seats. At the back table, there is a donation box, and the funds that goes into that donation box cover the cost of Arnold visiting New Zealand. So just on the book table, a white box for donations for Arnold's trip over here. And on the coffee bar, there is a box for questions. So if you've got any questions that you would like Arnold to answer, just put them in there and we'll go through them in question time. Arnold, they're waiting to hear the rest.
Okay, should be on page 8, small b, the land covenant. The land covenant is detailed in the book of Deuteronomy, chapters 29 and 30. And sometimes the question rises, since it's part of the 5th book of Moses, why is it a different covenant? And we'll look at it because it says it's a different covenant. Deuteronomy chapter 29. I'll look at verse 1. These are the words of the covenant which Jehovah commanded Moses to make with the children of Israel in the land of Moab, besides the covenant which he made with them in Horeb. Horeb is a mountain range, and Mount Sinai is part of the Horeb range. He points out what he's about to speak out in chapters 29 and 30 is a distinct covenant from the Mosaic. So it's not a covenant that's going to be unconditional, God makes with the people of Israel. And what he points out is 8 specific provisions, which I won't bother listing them all. But in the chapter 29 segment, he points out, initially, as this was being obedient, they will receive the blessings of the Mosaic covenant. But to become disobedient, there'll be different types of divine discipline. First of all, there'll be a discipline, there will be a subjugation, which was fulfilled in the days of the judges. Secondly, will come captivity, as was fulfilled by the Assyrian and the Babylonian captivities. And thirdly, there'll be a worldwide dispersion, which came as a direct result of Israel's rejection of the prophet like unto Moses, already mentioned previously in the same book, the book of Deuteronomy, back in chapter 18, verses 15 through 18, chapter 18, verses 15 through 18. Now, especially the importance of the land covenant, it reaffirms the land facet of the Abrahamic covenant, the land facet. It emphasizes Israel's ownership of the land is always unconditional. It is always Israel's land, whether in the land or outside the land belongs to Israel. So ownership is unconditional. However, enjoyment of the land is conditioned on obedience. And because this conditional obedience is the reason they have not ever enjoyed all of the promised land. So what this covenant does is confirm the fact of that the conditional Mosaic covenant did not render the Abrahamic covenant null and void. And later on, the prophets, a lengthy chapter, Ezekiel chapter 16, which has 63 verses, gives the details of the ongoing relationship of the land covenant. So let's turn to the book of Joshua, chapter 11. When Joshua brings the Jewish people over the Jordan River into the Promised Land, and he begins at first, it's a national conflict, so members of all 12 tribes make up the army. And by the end of chapter 11, the national war against the Canaanites has come to an end. So what he has to do, he's going to have to divide the land among the 12 tribes, and the individual tribes need to finish the conquest and finish the inheritance of the land. So looking at Joshua chapter 11, and look at verse 22. There was none of the Anakim left in the land of the children of Israel. I'm reading the long verse. Verse 23, so Joshua took the whole land according to all that Jehovah spoke unto Moses, and Joshua gave it for inheritance unto Israel according to their divisions by their tribes, and the land had rest from them. This is a very popular verse among replacement theology. There's 3 different branches of replacement theology, but they all like this verse. That all of the land promises has been fulfilled when you come to the end of chapter 11. Now, if you stop reading there, then we have an argument. But keep in mind, none of the books, when they're written to become scripture, none of them had chapter divisions, none of them had even verse divisions. These were done later to make it easier to find specific elements in the scriptures. So yes, at the end of 11, Joshua conquered the whole land. Chapter 12 goes on to list all the kings he killed in the national war. But now come to chapter 13 and verse 1. And Joshua was old and well stricken in years. And Jehovah said to him, you are old and well stricken in years, and there yet remains very much land to be possessed. And if you read to the end of the first paragraph, which is verse 7, Israel at this point didn't even have half of the promised land. But now the different tribes, as they received the territory to which they were settled, they were responsible to do the final conquest of those territories. So obviously, he's not contradicting in chapter 13 what he wrote in chapter 11, verse 23. You just continued the reading. He got all the land, he killed all these kings, but here are the exceptions to the rule. And as you begin to read, there are a number of small exceptions. For example, skip over to chapter 15 of Joshua, and look at verse 63. Joshua 15, verse 63, and as for the Jebusites, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the children of Judah could not drive them out. But the Jebusites dwell with the children of Judah at Jerusalem unto this day. Unto this day, meaning until the time the book of Joshua was finally finished. Now we get more of the story from the early chapters of the book of Judges. What the tribe of Judah did was conquer Jerusalem. And they were successful, but Jerusalem was not given to the tribe of Judah. Jerusalem was given to the tribe of Benjamin, and they failed to come in and settle it. The Jebusites came back and retook the city. And it remained a Jebusite city until the time of David. So for the first 7 years of his kingship, he ruled only as king over Judah. When he became king over all 12 tribes, he captured Jerusalem and made that his own private city. Look at chapter 16, verse 10. And they drove not out the Canaanites that dwell in Gezer, But the Canaanites dwell in the midst of Ephraim unto this day and become servants to do task work. And Benjamin was not successful. I should say the tribe was not successful in conquering the city. And even under David, it remained a Canaanite city. Only when Solomon married Pharaoh's daughter, then the Pharaoh came up and he took the city, which was on the Via Maris, the main trade route, and then turned the city over to Solomon. And so that was the situation over and over again. Now, let's transfer to the book of Judges. Judges chapter 1. Here's where he points out the tribe of Judah did succeed in taking Jerusalem in chapter 1, verses 8 onward. But again, the city was not given to the tribe of Judah, it was given to the tribe of Benjamin, which they failed to take advantage of what Judah did on their behalf. So looking at chapter 1, notice how often one tribe after another tribe began to fail. Verse 27, and Manasseh did not drive out the inhabitants of Beth Sha'am and its towns, nor of Taanach and its towns, the inhabitants of Dor and its towns, nor the inhabitants of Iblim and its towns, and the inhabitants of Megiddo and its towns, but the Canaanites would dwell in thy land. This is already in the transition between the last days of Joshua and the first days of the Judges. Verse 29, and Ephraim drove not out the Canaanites that dwelled in Gezer. Verse 30, Zebulun drove not out the inhabitants of Kithron, nor the inhabitants of Nahalal, nor the Canaanites that dwell among them. Verse 31, Asher did not drive out the inhabitants of Akko, nor the inhabitants of Sidon, nor Achlav, nor Achziv, nor of Helba, nor of Afik, nor of Rehov, but the Asherites dwelt among the Canaanites, but did not drive them out. Verse 33, Naphtali drove not out the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh, the inhabitants of Beth Anat, but he dwelt among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land. Nevertheless, the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh and of Beth Anat became subject to task work. Verse 34, and the Amorites forced the children of Dan into the hill country, for they would not suffer them to come down to the valley. For the Amorites would dwell in Mount Heres, in Ayalon, and in Shaalvim, yet the hand of the house of Joseph prevailed, so they became subject to task work. And so on. So either they failed to drive them out or they subjugated them as servants, but all of these failed to fulfill the Mosaic obligation that God gave them. The Canaanites must be expelled or destroyed or expelled. They cannot remain in the land. They were given 4 centuries to time to repent, and they failed to do so. Now look at chapter 2, verse 1. And the angel of Jehovah, when you see that phrase, the angel of Jehovah, the angel of the Lord, there's never a common, ordinary angel. It's a title to the second member of the triunity. And here he appears to the Jewish people. In verse 2, you shall make no covenant. And he points out they made a covenant without checking with him first. Now, in verse 6, notice he picks up Joshua still living at this stage. So there's an overlap in the last chapters of Joshua and the first chapters of Judges. So take chapter 2 and go down to verse 20. And the anger of Jehovah was kindled against Israel, and he said, because this nation has transgressed my covenant, which I commanded their fathers, and they not hearkened unto my voice, I also will not henceforth drive out any from before them of the nations that Joshua left when he died. That by them I may prove Israel, whether they will keep the way of Jehovah to walk therein, and as the fathers that keep it or not. So Jehovah left these nations without driving them out hastily. And notice, neither delivered he them into the hand of Joshua. So if you just take Joshua 11, verse 23, and this verse by itself, you have a contradiction. There's no contradiction, because if you keep the 11:23 in context, all right, by the end of the national wars, he conquered all the land, he killed all these kings, but right in chapter 13, the second chapter after chapter 11, here's the territories they have not yet taken. And there are many exceptions in the book of Joshua, and here you see some more exceptions. So there's no contradiction if you maintain the context. If you pull these verses out of context, then yes, you have a contradiction. But again, the land covenant emphasizes 2 points. Ownership of the land is unconditional, but the enjoyment of the land is conditioned on obedience. Let's move on to the Davidic covenant, small c. There's 2 main scriptures. The first one is 2 Samuel chapter 7, verses 11 through 17. 2 Samuel 7, verses 11 through 17. Here the focus is on David's immediate son, and that is Solomon. Here it points out if Solomon is faithful, God will bless him. But if he proves to be unfaithful, then God will discipline him. But one thing it says, I will never take away my loving kindness from Solomon as I took it from the one that ruled before you. And that would have been King Saul. King Saul was of the tribe of Benjamin. And God did not have any kind of covenant relationship with King Saul. So it does mention the possibility with Solomon. He's part of an unconditional covenant, and therefore God will never take away his loving kindness from Solomon. And he will, if he sins, he will be disciplined. But God will not take away the loving kindness from him. But the second main passage is 1 Chronicles chapter 17, verses 10 through 15. 1 Chronicles chapter 17, verses 10 through 15. It's very similar to the wording of the 2 Samuel 7 passage, except there's some key differences. Instead of focusing on an immediate son, he focuses on a son that will be a descendant of one of your seed. So this is a distant son, and this distant son will be the Messiah. And he goes on to point out that there's no possibility of him sinning. There's no emphasis, that doesn't mention any possibility of sinning, any possibility of a need for discipline, because this one would never be guilty of violating any sin, any commandment to sin. So this is also an unconditional covenant, very much in effect. Altogether in the Davidic covenant, there are 7 provisions. They're all detailed in your textbook. But in the end, if you put both the Samuel and Chronicles passage, he promises David 4 eternal things. Number 1, an eternal house or dynasty. Secondly, an eternal throne. Thirdly, an eternal kingdom. And fourthly, an eternal descendant. And the eternality of those first 3 eternal things, the house or dynasty, the throne, the kingdom, is guaranteed because the seed of David culminates in one who is himself eternal, the Messianic God-man. And a key element that's important about this covenant is it amplifies the seed facet of the Abrahamic covenant. The land covenant emphasized the land aspect. This one emphasizes the seed facet. And there's a gradual narrowing of the seed. It began with the seed of the woman, therefore he can come from any segment of humanity. In the Abrahamic covenant, he became the seed of Abraham, therefore is now limited to Jewish humanity. But that means any of the 12 tribes could qualify. But then in chapter 49, there's a narrowing of the seed further, the seed of Judah, and now it must come specifically of the Judean tribe. And now with the Davidic family, he picks one key element. And now the seed must come from the seed of David, from the family of David. There's going to be one more other narrowing we shall look at, Jeremiah chapter 22. In Jeremiah 22, Jeremiah lists some of the curses about the last kings of Judah. And he picks one king after another. The last of the good kings was Josiah. Now, the last several kings after Josiah, none of them did the right thing before the Lord. At beginning of verse 24, he focuses on one particular king known as Jeconiah, but uses a shorter name, Coniah, in verse 24, the son of Jehoiakim, and so on. He points out this son will be taken into captivity. He will spend the rest of his life in captivity in Babylonia, and there he will eventually die. But then the high point is reached. And often when God doubles a name or word, it just means you have to take it seriously, but this time he triples the word. Look at verse 29. O earth, 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 hear the word of Jehovah. And what he wants everybody to know is what's found in verse 30. Thus says Jehovah, write ye this man childless, a man that shall not prosper in his days, for no more shall a man of his seed prosper, sitting upon the throne of David and ruling in Judah. With this narrowing, the son has thus to be from the family of David, but no longer through Jeconiah. It should come to Matthew chapter 1, because he's writing to a Jewish audience that will be aware of this Jeconiah curse. He begins the account giving a genealogy starting with Abraham, since Abraham was the father of the Jews. And eventually he comes to Jeconiah. And Joseph, the stepfather of the Messiah, because he was the stepfather, Joseph himself could not be in the Messianic line. Since the Messiah was his adopted son, that does not mean that therefore Yeshua could take the throne. Jesus could take the throne. Because again, Joseph was not the heir apparent because of the Jeconiah curse. So because Matthew gives the Jeconiah line, he then goes on to tell the Jewish people, however, the Messiah, Jesus, was not born of that line. He was born of the family of David. But Joseph was not his biological son. And therefore, the Jeconiah curse would not apply to him, because he was not the physical son of Joseph. Luke has a different issue. he emphasizes the humanity of the Messiah. And so he doesn't begin with Abraham, he begins with Adam, which is the beginnings of humanity. And as you look at Luke's line, he's going to point out that that Miriam, the mother of Jesus, was of the house of David, but not from the Jeconiah line. So before the Jeconiah curse, you had to be a member of the house of David, but with the Jeconiah curse, you had to be a member of the house of David apart from Jeconiah. Joseph was part of that house. Mary was not. It says the Messiah was her biological son. Therefore, he was one of the people in the household of David, apart from Jeconiah, that could claim the throne. And in the development of kingship in the Hebrew Bible, there were two requirements. Number one, for Judah, every king had to be a member of the house of David. And in the role for Israel in the north, you have to have divine appointment or prophetic sanction, either appointed by a prophet or receive sanction from God. And therefore, several different kings, they never had a good king, but it didn't have any one long-standing dynasty. There were several dynasties that ruled in the northern kingdom. And so what we now learn from all this is that being a child of the Miriam or Mary mother, and that was a direct biological connection, therefore he fulfilled both requirements. He was a member of the house of David apart from Jeconiah, and later on in Luke chapter 2, he receives divine appointment. And the angel tells her, the Lord God shall give unto him the throne of his father David. She's the only descendant of descendant of David apart from Jeconiah that received prophetic sanction, and therefore he alone could claim the throne. There are further confirmations which are going to be in the textbook. One of the better ones is Psalm 89. It's a long psalm of 52 verses, but keeps emphasizing the fact of the uniqueness of the Son of David that proved to be the Messiah. And when Gabriel talks to Miriam or Mary, in Luke chapter 1, verses 30 through 70, Luke 1, 30 through 70, he focuses on those four eternal things. First of all, in verse 30 through 35, the eternal throne. And in verse 32, he says specifically, the Father will give to him the throne of his father David. Secondly, the eternal house. Also in verse 33, he will rule over the house of Jacob forever. Second part of verse 33, the third eternal thing, the eternal kingdom. Of his kingdom there shall be no end. And then in verse 32 and 35, he will be the eternal descendant. Of his kingdom there shall be no end. So in verse 32, he shall be called the Son of the Highest. In verse 35, he shall be called the Son of God. So between the line of David, apart from Jeconiah, and then receiving divine appointment, he alone qualifies to sit upon the throne of David, and since he takes the Davidic throne after his resurrection, not before, he does not need to have any successors. Okay, let's take one more covenant, the new covenant. The key passage on the new covenant is Jeremiah 31, verses 31 through 34. That's the parenthetical one. Jeremiah 31, verses 31 through 34. and received several confirmations from other prophets, all connecting it to be a Jewish covenant. He provides, within the Hebrew Bible, 9 specific provisions. And the key element of the new covenant is that it focuses on the spiritual blessings of the Abrahamic covenant, especially the blessing of salvation. So in relationship to the church, is the basis of the dispensation of grace. Relationship to Israel will be the basis for the dispensation of the kingdom. It's an unconditional covenant, still very much in effect. So these are the 4 unconditional covenants God made with the Jewish people. If you go to the next page, a Mosaic covenant, unlike the other 4 we just dealt with, is a conditional covenant. It is a bilateral covenant, not a unilateral covenant. And God makes a proposal, but he doesn't merely have a simple statement, I will, but the formula is, if you will, then I will. If you will, then I will. And God promises to grant certain blessings, providing that the one receiving the covenant will fulfill the conditions of the covenant. And failure to fulfill those conditions will result in some form of discipline. So conditions had to be met before God's blessings could be experienced. Now, the Mosaic covenant begins in Exodus chapter 20, verse 1, Exodus 20, verse 1, and continues until Deuteronomy 28, verse 68. Deuteronomy 28, 68, so it covers all of the book of Leviticus, all of the book of Numbers, and the first 28 chapters of Deuteronomy. So if you don't mind, we'll dispense with the reading of this covenant. But the persons involved is in Exodus 19, verses 3 through 8. Exodus 19, verses 3 through 8. And that is between God and Israel, and specifies he's making this covenant with the same people he brought out of Israel. He brought out of Egypt. The same people he brought out of Egypt. Now keep in mind, what God did not do is bring the Seventh-day Adventist church out of Egypt. He specifically brought Israel out of Egypt. And the signing of the covenant is in Exodus 24, verses 1 through 11, Exodus 24, verses 1 through 11, and it was ratified by blood. It was also sealed by the Shekinah glory, a visible glory. Now, there's the general glory of God that's not visible, but the Shekinah, the Shekinah glory, is always a visible glory in some form, and in most cases, the form was of a light, fire, cloud, or a combination of those 3 things. That's not the only way, but that's the primarily ways. And the key provision was the law of Moses. It's always important to remember the law of Moses is not confined to 10 commandments. It has a total of 613 commandments. It's a conditional covenant, and so blessings will be given for obedience, but curses for disobedience. in Exodus chapter 15, verse 26, Exodus 15, 26, in chapter 19, verses 3 through 8, chapter 19, verses 3 through 8. And the key element, as spelled out in the first 7 chapters of Leviticus, is blood sacrifices for all kinds of occasions. In chapter 16, the most solemn blood sacrifice, the sacrifices of the Day of Atonement. Leviticus chapter 17, verse 11, spells out the necessity of blood. Might be worthwhile reading the one verse. Leviticus chapter 17, verse 11. For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I've given it to you upon the altar to make atonement for your souls, for it is the blood that makes atonement by reason of the life. So after dealing with the 7, all kinds of different kinds of sacrifices, in chapter 16 with the most solemn of it all, a calf for the priest, but a goat for the people. And he spells out the principle in chapter 17, verse 11. Now, God could have chosen any other way to provide forgiveness, but he chose the method of the shedding of blood. Initially, animal blood, and the trouble with animal blood is they have to be repeated, but finally, Isaiah 53 prophesies there'll be human blood, Messiah's blood, which will be a once and for all sacrifice. Now, Hebrews 10 verses 1 through 4, Hebrews 10 verses 1 through 4 points out, the blood covered the sins, but it did not remove the sins. So sins were covered, but did not remove it, which is the reason when a saint of the Hebrew Bible died, he didn't go right to heaven. He went to Sheol, Hebrew or Hades Greek, and to one specific place, and that is Abraham's bosom. Only when Messiah died and provided the atonement for them, he is able to ascend and brought all of the saints in the Abraham's bosom with him to heaven. So animal blood provided forgiveness of sin and restoration of fellowship, but could not take the sin away. Now, emphasizing in parenthetical 6 the importance of this covenant, let me show you how it relates to some previous covenants, like the Noahic covenant. It restricted the dietary allowance. For example, from Adam to Noah, man was to be purely vegetarian. But then with the Noahic covenant, what God says, anything that moves, you can eat it. If it moves, it's edible. But the Mosaic covenant for the Jewish people restricted the diet in 4 areas. As far as animals, the animals had to be both cloven hoofed and chewed the cud. If it's seafood, it had to have both fins and scales. As far as birds, no birds of prey. Any bird that eats flesh was not edible. As far as insects, only one type of locust was allowed. Although Moses said, I can have this one type of locust, tell it not in Gath and publish it not in the streets of Ashkelon, I would much rather have a ham on rye than a locust on a bagel. Furthermore, the Noahic covenant only required the death penalty for premeditated murder, but the Mosaic covenant for the Jewish people required the death penalty for many other kinds of sins, like idolatry, adultery, cursing God, cursing parents. Another way it shows the relationship with another covenant is the Abrahamic covenant. And circumcision was the sign or seal of the Abrahamic covenant. But now with the Mosaic law, it was not only a sign of Jewish identity, but also the means of submission to the law. So if Gentiles wanted to participate in the spiritual blessings of the Jewish covenants, they would have to convert to Mosaic Judaism by undergoing circumcision, but also fulfilling the Mosaic laws. So it became the basis for the dispensation of the law, and the token of the covenant was keeping of the Sabbath. We'll say more about the Sabbath tomorrow, but it was to be, the Sabbath be the sign of the covenant. Okay. It's a quarter to the hour, and you have 15 minutes for questions. So now, from now till 9 o'clock, we'll open the floor for questions. If you have a question, raise your hand. And who wants to be first? Okay, we'll skip the first question. Who wants to be second? Any second questions? Okay, we'll skip that one. Who's got the third question? Anybody got? Okay, here we go.
It doesn't have to be about tonight. Can it be about anything? Within reason. I'm still processing tonight.
Any question I'd like to limit it to what we covered, but for other questions I'll be covering tomorrow, the next day, and so on. So what's your question? What is your question?
Well, it was nothing to do with this, but I'm just pondering lots of things. I just wondered.
I'll ask it anyway. If it's something I'll cover later, I'll let you know.
Okay, it was actually something we've been studying recently, and it was just a comment about where you think Elijah and Enoch went when they were taken. If you have an opinion on that.
Well, it's not relevant to what we're doing.
No,
so
that's what I'm saying.
I can answer that question before.
Yeah.
I'm not going. But these are the only two men thus far that didn't die. So they were, and to go to Abraham's bosom, you have to die first. They were right to heaven, and that's where they are to this day. Elijah will come back to tell the Jewish people certain things, and what those things are, we'll get into later. But they're both in heaven, and they never died, and they would, because they're in heaven, they're now glorified. The same thing with living saints at the rapture. We're never going to, if we are raptured in our lifetime, then we'll never die. We'll be glorified at some point, and then enjoy the Messianic kingdom for 1,000 years. Question?
Right, Dr. Arnold. Okay, I hope this is not too troubling, this question. I've led a few Bible study groups where our study in Romans, there seems to be, perhaps this is quite common, there'll be often points within Romans that are particular stumbling blocks for those. And one that I've recently come across, and it's probably very postmodern and a very touchy-feely sort of thing in these troubled times we live in, end days, is the issue of the verses both in Hebrew and in Greek from Malachi 1, chapter 1, verse 3, and Romans 9, verse 13. Jacob I loved,
And Esau,
but Esau I hated.
Yeah.
So is our Bible translations, and I usually use the NASB, are they accurate and fair to use the word hated?
One way it's used is like in English, it's used emotionally, but English is mostly on the emotional level, to love or to hate. But in most passages, the terms love and hate focuses on whether to choose or not to choose. To choose something is to love it, not to choose it is to hate it. So that in most cases, that's the way it should be better understood. And he didn't hate Esau emotionally, but didn't choose Esau to be in the covenantal line. So in that sense, he was hated. So sometimes it's not that, sometimes it is emotional, but most of the times the Bible uses it, it's more a matter he chose or he didn't choose.
So it's pure election. It is literally double election.
It's what?
It is pure election. So
It's election, but on the basis of God chose. But sometimes elections to do with salvation, but sometimes to do with matter of fulfilling Lord Israel. He elected Israel, didn't mean everybody in Israel got saved.
So I was just wondering, this covenants, can we as Gentiles also claim them as our own, or is it only for the Jewish people?
Okay, say it again.
So the promises and the covenants that God made with Abraham,
Yeah.
all these ones that you've went through, can we also say as Gentiles, it's covenants that God made with everybody, being Abraham was the father of faith for us all, or is it just for the Jewish people?
Actually, we're going to deal with that tomorrow. I'll just give you a short sentence now and give you a detail later. But these covenants were made with Israel, so the covenants belong to Israel. But the key term that Bible uses in 3 key passages is the term partaker. The Gentiles have become partakers of the spiritual blessings of the Jewish covenants, like the olive tree. The olive tree represents the spiritual blessings of the Jewish covenants. But if you look at chapter 11, verse 24, who owns the tree? And it's not the wild olive branches, it's the natural branches. And God says he can graft the natural branches into their own olive tree. And it's a possessive pronouns, 2 of them. So Israel is the owner of the tree. But the word that uses for Gentile believers in 3 passages we'll be looking at tomorrow, and that is the partaking is the key word uses. Gentiles have become partakers of the spiritual blessings, but not the physical blessings like the blessing of the land. But we're going to say more about that tomorrow.
Kia ora, Arnold. My name is David. I'd like to go back to the blood sacrifices. Sorry, I'll stand up.
You want to go back to the blood sacrifices?
Yeah, it's a very interesting topic. I would like to explore it. Now, I just want to ask, I might have missed this. Can you explain to me, like, blood covered the sin, did not remove the sin? Just explain a little bit further, because I kind of missed that part.
Well, it's based upon Hebrews chapter 10, verses 1 through 4, especially verse 4, that animal blood could not take away the sin. So the sins were covered, they received forgiveness, they were conscious that God forgave them, but they eventually had to offer another sacrifice because never continue, they cannot from that point on live a perfect life in this life. And so the animal blood was limited to what it can do about the sin. But his blood will finally take the sin away. So that's the key difference between animal blood, which had to be repeated, and Messiah's blood, which was once and for all.
I just had a question about the covenants. You talked about, for example, they amplify an aspect of the Abrahamic covenant. How do you see all these different covenants, I guess, linking up?
How do I see them? I mean, the 4 unconditional covenants we talked about are the Jewish covenant. There are other covenants before that. There was the Adamic covenant, which was conditional, no longer functioning. Then you had the Adamic and Noahic covenants, which was given for the world in general, because there weren't any Jews yet. Jewish history begins in chapter 12. And so these are 2 covenants that were functional, also unconditional. But in the issue of the Jewish people, these 4 covenants that we did talk about were unconditional covenants meant for the Jewish people, though as early as Genesis 12:3, he promised someday the Gentiles will begin to participate in the spiritual blessings, and you shall all the families of the earth be blessed. But ultimately that comes with a new covenant, and tomorrow when we deal with Israel present, we're going to come back to this point.
Someone else in
Hi, good day, Arnold. Hi. Re- I don't know if I heard you correctly, but did you say that circumcision was a token? Or because I'm just thinking, there is blood there,
Well, the different kinds of covenants, but the blood covenant is the one that God made with Abraham. And because God alone walked between the pieces of the animals cut in half, then it rendered the covenant unconditional. So the Abrahamic covenant became unconditional. Abraham slept with a vision. It was a visionary sleep because he could see what was happening. As a result, God alone, in visible form in the Shekinah glory, went between the pieces of the animals, and because he alone is unconditional. And Abraham fails the very next chapter, didn't render the covenant null and void. There's still God's covenant with Abraham.
Hi, I just wondered if you could expand a little bit on the bosom of Abraham. You mentioned that, and I'm thinking of Luke 16, the rich man and Lazarus, and you just touched on the bosom of Abraham as a bit of a part of Sheol. Could you just give me a bit more on that?
Well, Abraham's bosom is mentioned only in one passage in Scripture, but it was part of rabbinic writing, so we have the wider audience and so on. But because animal blood could not take the sin away, when a believer dies before Messiah's death, he could not die and go right to heaven. So the body stayed in the ground somewhere, but the soul, spirit, heart, mind, conscience, and will, the 6 facets of the immaterial part of man, continues in the conscious existence. And they went down to Sheol or Hades, where sometimes people assume is always hell. It's not always hell. It depends what context. But in this case, they went down to a section where saints went to, Abraham's bosom, and that's where they stayed until Messiah ascended. And when Messiah died, his body was put into the tomb, but the immaterial part of him went into Abraham's bosom, and was able to declare to the believers that their sins has been removed, and they will soon be ascending into heaven when he ascends into heaven, which was 40 days later. So today, that side of Sheol Hades is empty, nobody's there. The other side had 3 subdivisions. You had hell for humans. You had the abyss, which was a temporary place of confinement for fallen angels and demons. Then there was Tartarus, which was for those angels that intermarried with human women to try to destroy the seed of the woman, and so on. And so all those are still there. And that eventually they'll be brought up to the great white throne judgment, receive their judgment, and be thrown into the lake of fire. So someday that side of Sheol Hades will also be empty.
Hey Arnold, can I ask 2 related questions, like 2A, 2B sort of questions?
Yeah, you can do stuff, but go one at a time, because if you go 2, then B, I'll forget about A.
Yeah, first one, if Jeconiah's line was cursed, why was he included in the Matthew 1 genealogy? First one, and the second one is, was his curse ever reversed?
No, the curse was a Jeconiah curse. That was never reversed. It's not the curse. He has a second part of the question, but hello? Don't you have a second part?
Sorry, you did say them both, Arnold.
Oh, the first one was, if Jeconiah's line was cursed, why was he included in both genealogies, in Matthew's genealogy?
Well, because he's in that line, and Jewish people know that the Jeconiah curse means no descendant of Jeconiah could sit upon the throne of David. So he didn't want to make it sound like Joseph, the stepfather of Jesus, he can turn over his right to rule to his adopted son. That was not the means, that was not the method, because the Jeconiah curse did not suddenly get absolved. It was still there. And so, and therefore he begins with the virgin, begins with the genealogy, and then goes to the virgin birth account to show that this was not the biological son and the biological father. Luke does not have that opinion, so he reverses it. He goes all the way back to Adam, but he does not have a Jeconiah problem. So he just traces the line all the way back. So the order by which he deals with the whole virgin birth account. He does not give a genealogy until the 3rd chapter, because he has no Jeconiah problem to worry about.
Yeah, hey Arnold, just a question around, you've got one extreme around replacement theology, then you've almost got another extreme where you've got those who are claiming to be lost tribes of Israel, Hebrew roots, and a lot of indigenous people are taking on that lost tribe focus. So I guess my question is, why do you think that seems to be quite a popular theology? Because there's so much confusion around who those lost tribes are, at least for those groups.
Well, first of all, there was never such a thing as the 10 lost tribes of Israel. And when the Jewish people came back from captivity, it wasn't just from the Babylonian captivity, others came back from the Assyrian captivity. So, for example, you have the mention in Luke chapter 2 of Anna, or Hannah, and she's of the tribe of Asher. That's one of those 10 lost tribes. She's not lost. She's right there in Jerusalem telling people she saw the Messiah and so on. So members of all 10, 12 tribes stayed where they were, and members of all 12 tribes came back. There never was such a thing as the 10 lost tribes of Israel. You also have people like in, I forget the movement itself, but the people of England was of the tribe of one son of Joseph. The people of America were the other tribe's son. That is just mythology. There's no Jews have a good record of their history, and it's none of that is in there. That's the Armstrong movement. That was the movement, Bedouin movement, and so on. But the Jews today can come from any of the 12 tribes, and people sometimes ask me, "What tribe am I from?" Well, only the tribe of Levi kept their identity. Other tribes did not keep their identity. So I tell people, some of my friends think I'm from the tribe of Schmohawk, and so on. I don't buy that, but that's what they say. Okay, our time is up. You got one question?
Thanks very much for speaking tonight. I'm just trying to understand the heart of God, and God demonstrates amazing love in paying with his own blood in the covenant ultimately. But it is difficult to reconcile when you see, I guess, the conquest with Canaan and expelling the Canaanites, and even down to the nitty-gritty details. And I'm just interested to hear your idea of the heart of God and reconciling the two.
I'm not sure I'm really catching the question exactly.
The fact that in the Old Testament it seems that God does things which today we would consider quite difficult to swallow, quite hard. Yet in New Testament things it's the revelation of the love of God, and I'm wondering how you reconcile the two.
I'm not sure there's anything to reconcile, because animal blood was the form of blood forgiveness that God chose to provide, and that's it. And even Paul, who was clearly teaching that we don't have to offer blood sacrifices for sin, not all blood sacrifices will live into sin. For example, he took a Nazirite vow, and he had to keep that vow until the time was up, and that required the blood sacrifices. And then later on in chapter 21, the book of Acts, when he comes back to Jerusalem, he shares the wealth he collected for the Jewish congregation of Jerusalem and so on. And then and because he was dealing with other people that took a vow similar to his vow, he was not only going to pay for his vow, blood sacrifices, but also pay for their vow, blood sacrifice. But those are the fulfillment of a vow, which is not relevant specifically to sin. So apparently there's no problem with other sacrifices that were not directly relevant to sin. And those Paul never offered, but did offer other kinds of sacrifices that were not relevant to sin. All right, we'll have these sessions again tomorrow. And so see you either here, there, or in the air.